Modern quantitative finance is trapped in a cycle of diminishing returns. The vast majority of systematic trading algorithms, including sophisticated deep learning models, feed raw or minimally processed equity prices directly into their engines to search for patterns. The problem with those raw prices is that they are overwhelmingly driven by massive, universally tracked macroeconomic forces. If you look at a major energy equity like Petrobras, its daily price movements are strictly tethered to the global price of Brent crude. This is common knowledge, heavily arbitraged, and devoid of any unique trading edge. Beyond the physical commodity, the price is further obscured by a secondary macroeconomic layer, currency fluctuations. For a Brazilian equity, the USD to real exchange rate drags the stock up or down entirely independent of the company's actual performance. MIT researcher Marcus Burgo identified that trying to find an edge in these massive numbers is futile. True, exploitable alpha lives exclusively in the idiosyncratic residuals, the faint, unexplained price movements left over only after these massive macroeconomic layers are mathematically stripped away. This explains why so many machine learning approaches fail in financial markets. They attempt to predict the macro noise itself, effectively trying to outguess the entire global consensus on oil and currency, rather than isolating the faint residual signals where true informational imbalances hide. If you are trading raw prices, you are trading noise. Establishing a genuine, repeatable edge requires isolating the residual before any predictive analysis even begins. Trading residuals introduces a specific hidden vulnerability. Because these isolated signals are incredibly faint, they are highly susceptible to statistical mirages and false positives. A standard predictive point estimate model, one that confidently declares a 65% probability of a stock rising, will eventually bankrupt a fund. It fails to account for the uncertainty of its own parameters and the probability that its underlying assumptions are flawed. To survive, a system must constantly assume its own predictive signals are on the verge of failing. This requires a recursive probability architecture, a mathematical defense mechanism that forces the model to calculate the probability that its own probabilities are incorrect. Constructing this defense requires 4 sequential steps: isolating the pure residuals, proving rigorous causality, modeling the predictable panic of the human herd, and finally, structuring a Bayesian cascade to mathematically penalize overconfidence. Quantifying its own ignorance is the primary mechanism for a systematic trading engine's survival. This equation breaks down the standard equity returns into 3 core components: alpha, the known macroeconomic factors, and epsilon, the unexplainable residual. Epsilon is the specific target of this framework. A naive approach to finding epsilon is to calculate the historical sensitivity of the stock to macro factors using static linear regression. In finance, this is catastrophic. Market regimes shift rapidly. A stock's sensitivity to oil during a pandemic looks entirely different than during a supply shortage. The quantitative solution is the Kalman-Foter, originally developed in 1960 for aerospace navigation to track spacecraft trajectories through noisy data. It acts here as a dynamic macro neutralization engine. Rather than holding macro sensitivities fixed, the filter allows the beta coefficients to evolve smoothly. At each step, it updates its estimate based on new observations, adapting to shifting realities without overfitting daily noise. This process runs constantly in the background of the architecture, serving as an ongoing, iterative noise removal engine. Without the Kalman filter dynamically stripping the macro beta from the data stream, any subsequent attempts at causality testing would be immediately poisoned by regime-shifting noise. Once the pure residual is isolated, we face a data fusion challenge. The system ingests 10 heterogeneous API feeds, ranging from weather anomalies to regulatory filings. Testing all these variables against the residual creates a massive risk of curve fitting. To prevent this, every potential signal must survive a triple validation gauntlet. The first layer is the cross-correlation function, which simply proves that a baseline linear relationship exists between a variable and the target residual. The second layer is rolling Granger causality. Developed by Nobel laureate Clive Granger, this test establishes strict temporal precedence, mathematically verifying that historical values of process X carry specific information that improves the prediction of process Y. This 3-panel validation process culminates in transfer entropy, Unlike Granger causality, it does not assume a linear relationship. It measures the directional, nonlinear flow of Shannon information, a metric of uncertainty reduction, moving directly into the future state of the equity residual. Applying this gauntlet yields stark empirical results. For example, using transfer entropy, the framework proved that Reddit's social media sentiment is mathematically synchronous, not predictive. For large-cap Brazilian equities, the retail crowd reacts to price movements at the exact same time they occur, offering zero lead time advantage. A signal is only treated as a genuine, tradable economic mechanism if it survives all three distinct layers of mathematical validation. Markets are ultimately human systems. The framework accounts for the behavioral reality of the 6-minute investor, retail participants who spend minimal time researching and instead follow herd momentum, particularly in volatile emerging markets. The quantitative edge discovered in the residuals is largely just the temporal gap between an informed, systematic signal, like a spike in corn feed prices, and the delayed, overreactive panic of the retail herd hitting the protein sector 3 days later. This exposes a critical vulnerability. Herd momentum and these behavioral pathways only function predictably during stable macroeconomic regimes. During an exogenous systemic shock, like a sudden political crisis or a massive liquidity drain, these patterns collapse. Correlations across the market immediately approach 1, meaning every stock moves together, and the idiosyncratic residuals vanish entirely. To defend against this, the system deploys a Markov switching model and tracks the Hurst exponent. The Hurst exponent measures the long-range dependence in a time series, while the Markov model continuously calculates the probabilistic odds that the market has transitioned out of a normal state and into a shock state. When a shock is detected, the framework does not attempt to predict the ensuing chaos. It actively severs its reliance on behavioral signals and aggressively throttles down trading risk until mathematical normalcy returns. This brings us to the intellectual core of the architecture, Bayesian hierarchical inference. It is a mathematical structure designed to calculate the probability of a probability. A 65% base signal drops through level 1, calculating Bayesian posterior probability. Level 2 multiplies this by the Markov switching model's market stability probability. Finally, level 3 uses Bayesian model averaging to hedge the underlying math. The 65% is mathematically crushed to just 46.8%. This mathematical humbling prevents the system from making concentrated bets on fragile data, serving as its ultimate survival mechanism. This Kelly criterion formula translates that heavily penalized effective probability into actionable capital allocation. The Kelly formula calculates the optimal bet size for maximizing long-term geometric growth. By plugging our severely reduced effective probability into the p-variable, the system outputs highly conservative allocation limits. The result is a mathematically rigorous portfolio construction. It generates a series of explicitly uncorrelated, fractionally sized bets, where risk exposure scales purely on proven mathematical confidence, rather than human conviction. In a 14-month backtest using real market data and a $20,000 capital base, the architecture maintained monthly returns between 28 and 32% without a single parameter adjustment. This performance stems from capturing thin, idiosyncratic price inefficiencies in the residuals that are invisible to larger institutional flows. But there is a strict physical limit to this performance. These returns cannot scale to the multi-billion-dollar sizes of institutional hedge funds. As allocated capital scales past specific daily volume thresholds, the act of entering and exiting the market inevitably moves the stock price. This self-inflicted market impact destroys the exact fragile residual edge the entire system relies upon to function. The singularity metaphor reveals the reality of the edge, the disciplined application of state-space econometrics, rigorous causality testing, and the precise mathematical quantification of one's own ignorance.